Hi everybody. This chapter is the foundation for everything else we'll be learning in records management. And so if you understand these basic rules, you'll be able to organize, store, and find records accurately, whether you're working with paper files or digital systems. And so over the next few slides, I'm going to break down the key concepts that guide how we arrange names and business titles alphabetically. So when we talk and think about managing business records, whether it's customer files, vendor folders, or maybe even employee records, we need a system that's both consistent and easy to use. And so the most common and straightforward method is the alphabetic filing system, where everything is arranged from A to Z. And so, for example, if you've ever looked up maybe a patient file in a clinic or a student record in admissions, you might know how important it is that Anderson would be filed before Brown, and Brown would be filed before Ching. And organizations follow standard rules published by ARMA International. And it just helps make sure that everyone files the same way, and it can help prevent confusion as well as save time. One of the first terms or new terms that you'll hear this week is the term indexing. Indexing just means figuring out what name to file something under. And so, for example, if a letter is addressed to Terry Ann Brown at Hawaii Community College, do we file it under the last name Brown, or do we file it under Hawaii Community College? And so we call that chosen name or category the filing segment. And it's basically how we'll look for the record later on. So when we need to retrieve it, if we ever need to use it for anything. So indexing just helps make sure that everyone who uses the file room or digital system knows exactly where to find that record. And so each word in a filing segment is called an indexing unit. And so let's say the record is for Laura J. Huff. So we have somebody's first name, which is Laura, J is her middle initial, and Huff is her last name. And that breaks down into 3 separate units for this particular example. The key unit is the first one we look at. And in this case, as we'll learn, if we have a personal name, the last name is always filed first. So that means in the name Laura J. Huff, Huff is our key unit. It's the name that we're filing this under. This tells me that I would file this in my H folder. After that, we would separate into separate units for her first name, and then if she had a middle initial, the middle initial would be last. But basically, indexing units just gives us a step-by-step order, so files stay consistent no matter who's indexing them. So once you decide where a record belongs, you would then code it. So coding means assigning a label or a file designation. So that could be typing the name on a folder or maybe tagging it in a digital system if we were working with digital records. And the coding step just helps ensure that the same rules we use to index are also applied to how we physically store and retrieve that record. And so, although it sounds pretty similar, let's go back to our indexing. So, indexing is basically mentally figuring it out and trying to figure out, okay, what file is this going to be filed under? Coding is the actual assigning of each of those units. So here we can code this by underlining the key unit, and then between each unit, so between Huff and Sons construction, we put a forward slash. This just helps separate each unit. And then we also label the units by putting a 2 over the second unit, a 3 over the third unit, and a 4 over the fourth unit. Notice that every time you have a key unit, you only underline it. We do not put a number 1 over that. And now let's take a look at the first rule. There's going to be 10 rules that you'll be learning about the alphabetic filing system within the next few weeks. And it's really important that you get a good grasp of these rules, especially this week, as everything that we learn is going to build upon these specific rules. So the first rule deals with personal names and the indexing order of them. So for personal names, the specific order is always their last name. So their last name is always going to be the key unit. Next is going to be their first name. And then if they have a middle initial, that would be the third unit. So if we take a look at these 3 names here, we have Charlene Sample. These are all personal names, meaning that this is her first name, Sample is her last name. Here, Darren is a first name, Sample is a last name. Here, Darlene is a first name, we have A as the middle initial, and Samples is the last name. So when we index them, we first figure out, okay, how is this going to be filed? So because this is a personal name, according to Rule 1, we always file it by the last name. So since her last name is Sample, Sample is the key unit, and then the second unit is her first name, which is Charlene. Same thing for number 2. His last name is Sample, so that's our key unit. Unit 2 would be Darren. And the reason why we separate this into separate units is so that we can identify the correct filing order. So when we have people that have the same last name, we would then have to look at the second unit to see which file would be filed first. So they're both going to be filed in an S folder for Sample. However, because they're the same, we then look at the second unit, and here the C in Charlene, so the C in the alphabet comes before D, so Charlene would be filed before Darren. And then finally, we have Darlene A. Samples. So Samples is her key unit. Unit 2 is her first name, and Unit 3 is A. And because her last name is Samples, it's filed after any sample last names. This also brings us to the nothing before something rule. So notice that there's a nothing after Sample, so those are filed before the last name, which has something else at the end. Okay, so this was just the personal names. So if you just have a first, last, and middle initial, we always index first the last name, then the first name, and then if they have a middle initial. When it comes to business names, we file them exactly as they're written, with one exception that I'll go over in a little bit. But for the majority of times, when you file a business name, they're going to be indexed exactly as it's written. So here, if we take a look at this first example, we have Samantha Seeger Designs. So although it has somebody's name in it, this is still a business name. So if it was just Samantha Seeger, that would be a personal name. But Samantha Seeger Designs tells me this is a business name. Because it's a business name, each word is a separate unit, but we don't rearrange them. So here, our key unit is always going to be the first word in our filing segment. So Samantha is our key unit, Seeger is unit 2, Designs is unit 3. For secure design, this is another example of a business name. Here our key unit is secure, and then design is unit 2. And then finally, for number 3, we have secure digital networks. Secure is our key unit, digital is unit 2, networks is unit 3. You'll notice in this example as well that it is in alphabetic order. So Samantha is filed before secure. That's because SA is before SE. And then if you take a look at numbers 2 and 3, where we both have secure as our key units, we would then look at unit 2. Although they both begin with a D, we look at the second letter. And that's why here the I is briefly underlined. So the DE in design is filed before the DI in digital. So let's move on to the second rule. So business names often have or contain small words like the word the, of, and, or even the word for. They might even have symbols like the and symbol or the plus symbol, or maybe even the percent symbol. And so each of these, whether it's a small word or a symbol, they need to be separate units when you file them. It's also important to note that symbols need to be spelled out. So like here for number 1, the and in A&A drilling needs to be spelled out. Also, if a business name begins with the word the is the last unit in the filing segment. And so this is the one exception that I mentioned about filing business names, that it's always going to be as it's written, except if the business name begins with the word the. And so we do this because there are so many companies that start with the word the, that if we kept it at the beginning, we'd end up with possibly hundreds of folders or files, all starting with the same word. Kind of like the coffee bean company or the flower shop or the furniture warehouse. And then they'd all just pile up under your T folder. And so by moving the word the to the end, we file them under the main identifying word instead. So the coffee bean company would become coffee bean company the, or the on-dog market becomes on-dog market the. I know it sounds funny when you say it out, but it really helps when you file it to make sure that the word the is the last unit. And so again, this just makes it much easier to locate records because businesses are grouped by what they actually are and not by a common article that doesn't actually add any meaning. Next, let's take a look at punctuation. So all punctuation and possessives are ignored. And this is a very hard rule. There are no exceptions to this. So let's take a look at number 2. So of course for number 1, from that previous rule I said that all symbols need to be spelled out. So this is Grant and Reardon Sales. But for number 2, notice that we have a possessive or that apostrophe in Grants. We also have a comma after shop and then a period after the shortened word of incorporated. When we code this and separate them into units, again, we do not include any of those punctuation marks. So Grants is simply Grants. We have Barbara, barber. There's no comma after shop, and then no period after ink. Okay, and as you read through the e-text, again, it mentions that these are underlined just so that you can see the differences. So grants would be filed under grant. icandoit.com would be filed after I, okay, and so forth. If we take a look at number 4, so we have I can do Windows exclamation. When we code this, remember we need to disregard punctuation. So we're going to not include any exclamation mark at the end here. And finally, for number 5, notice that we have underscores. So I underscore, can underscore, do underscore, it.com. Because there are no spaces, there's just underscores, this becomes an entire key unit. If there was a space, I space, can space, do space, it.com, then they would be separate units. But because they're just punctuation marks, we would treat this underscore the same way that we treat this apostrophe. We just ignore it and continue writing it. So I can do it, com is our key unit. Also, by removing these punctuation marks and disregarding possessives, it makes searching faster, and it also eliminates mistakes that might be caused by apostrophes or even hyphens. For Rule 4, this is going to deal with single letters and abbreviations. Specifically, I'm going to talk first about personal names. And so, for personal names, each initial is a separate unit. And so I'm going to pull an example up. And so let's say that we have this address card here. So here we have someone's name that is J.R. Anderson. Because this is a personal name, Anderson would be the key unit, J would be the second unit, and then R would be unit 3. Okay, and that's because there are spaces in between both the J and the R. Remember that we disregard the punctuation. And so if we were to file this, this would be filed under Anderson and then J.R. So let's get back to this. Also, if you have any abbreviations or nicknames, we wouldn't spell out that abbreviation unless there was a note to do so. And so that's going to bring us into the business part of the business name part of Rule 4. So business names, we follow the same principle. For single letters, they would be indexed as written. Any acronyms or abbreviations would be 1 unit. And finally, even radio and TV call signs like KKRS, they would count as 1 unit. And KKRS is counted as 1 unit because we don't have any spaces in between them. If we take a look at number 1, ACT Realty, there are spaces between the A and the C and the C and the T. So that tells me that they need to be separated into separate units. Also for number 3, and this comes back to our abbreviations. So we have Ackerson and Day Manufacturers. We've spelled out the symbol and then notice that we do not spell out manufacturers. We just leave it as MFGS. And going back to our previous rule about punctuation and possessives, we disregard the period. So we do not include that at the end of the unit. There are going to be instances when a record could logically fit in more than one place, and that's when we would use what's called a cross-reference. A cross-reference is kind of like a note that just says, hey, this document is filed under so-and-so's name, but you might also look under another name. Basically, your cross-reference helps prevent lost time searching under the wrong name. It's important to note, though, to use these sparingly because too many cross-references can clutter up your files. But there are specific rules when you do need to create cross-references. So let's take a look at the first cross-reference rule. So first, you might create cross-references for personal names that are easily confused. And this is especially true for people with last names that could also be first names. So let's take a look at this first example where we have Charles David. Because David is underlined, we're assuming that this is his last name and it's the key unit. But somebody might think that that's his first name and Charles is his last name. So what we would do is to create a cross-reference under Charles that has a little C notation that says C. David Charles. And so this cross-reference card would be filed under C for Charles, and then at the bottom it would say C, and the notation would be for David Charles. And it has to be in the order that it would be filed. So C, David, because the original record would be filed under your D folder, and then Charles. And so I'm going to pull up an example of this. So let's say that we have these folders here, and we're looking for someone's record, but we don't know if David is the first name or if it's the last name. So what I'm going to do is to go into my D folder to look for David. And here's the folder or the file that I created, and it's a cross-reference sheet. So this is what basically my cross-reference sheet says. So it has the cross-reference name, so David as my key unit. It's filed under my D folder, and then unit 2 is Russell. At the bottom is my C notation. So the C notation is telling whoever is looking for the record that they need to go to the Russell file, and then it's filed under David. So I'm going to go to my R folder and look for Russell David. And here's the original record. Okay, so your cross-reference is always going to refer you back to the original document. We're also going to need to create a cross-reference for hyphenated surnames or hyphenated last names. In this case, we have Wendy Reardon Bruss. So maybe her maiden name was Reardon and her spouse's last name was Bruss. Instead of taking their last name, she decided to hyphenate it. So originally, her file would be filed under R for Reardon Bruss, and then unit 2 would be Wendy. Notice that Reardon Bruss is all underlined. If we were to write it out, it would look like just Reardon Bruss without the dash. Remember that we always disregard punctuation. And so the cross-reference sheet that we would create for this, for a hyphenated personal name, it's going to first be by the second part of her last name, so Bruss, and then her first name, and then the first part of her last name. So the cross-reference is going to be for Bruss, Wendy, Reardon. Bruss, Wendy, Reardon. Bruss is your key unit. For the cross-references, we do separate them. And then the C notation would be C, Reardon, Bruss, Wendy. And so let's take a look at another example of this. So for example, let's say I have someone's name whose first name is Jennifer, and then her hyphenated last name is Taylor-Anderson. Her original file would be under T for Taylor, but what if somebody only knows her by the Anderson last name? So if someone only knew her by the Anderson last name, they would be able to go to their A folder after a cross-reference was created and find the one for Anderson, Jennifer, and then Taylor. So here's what that cross-reference would look like. So Anderson would be the key unit, Jennifer is the second unit, Taylor is the third unit. And the original file that it's filed under is always in our C notation, which is C Taylor Anderson, Jennifer. And so that tells me that I need to go to my T folder, and here's that file. So this was the original file with her address on it, and it's filed under Taylor Anderson, Jennifer. And as you can see here, as you label your files, I disregarded the hyphen between Taylor and Anderson. Even though it's written here, we always disregard punctuation and possessives. And so hopefully you can see just from this past two examples why we use cross-references. It's because we might not know the exact name, but that cross-reference sheet that we create will always refer us back to the original document or record. Okay, another reason why we might use cross-references is when people have similar sounding surnames or last names, or they might have alternative names. So if Michelle Starr is also known as Michelle Starkinski, we would have to create a cross-reference for that alternate name that she might go by. And another common reason why we use cross-references is when people have similar sounding last names that could be easily confused. So if you're working in maybe a medical office or HR department, and maybe you have several clients or employees with last names like Brown or Brown with an E at the end, or Braun or Brawn, they all sound nearly identical, but each one is spelled a little differently. And so if a staff member or a client calls and says, I need the file for Mr. Brown, you might not immediately know which one that they mean. And so to avoid confusion, we also create cross-reference sheets for those variations. And so if the actual file or record is filed under Brown, B-R-O-W-N, the files under Brown with an E, B-R-A-U-N, and B-R-A-W-N will each have a note that says see also, and then the other spellings. And so this would be one cross-reference sheet, this would be another cross-reference sheet, and this one too would be a cross-reference sheet. Okay, and so this step just helps keep your filing system accurate, and it can save time when people aren't sure how a name is spelled. Now let's take a look at how cross-referencing works for compound business names. So those that join two or more distinct names. So here we have Jarvis, Rasmussen, and Sheridan Antiques. So a compound business name has two or more last names in that business names. So think about companies like Levitt, Yamani, and Soldner, or Castle and Cook. Each business name combines at least two partners' names, and someone searching for that record might not remember both. And so to keep the filing system accurate, we file the record under the complete name, for instance, Jarvis, Rasmussen, and Sheridan Antiques. And then we would create another cross-reference for the second name. And in this case, if there's 3, we would have to create a second cross-reference. So again, if we have Jarvis, Rasmussen, and Sheridan Antiques as the original business name, we would create a cross-reference sheet first for the second name. We always go in order, so Rasmussen, Sheridan, and then the word and, so Rasmussen, Sheridan, and Jarvis Antiques. Our C notation always refers us back to the original, so C, Jarvis, Rasmussen, and Sheridan Antiques. So this one would be filed under R for Rasmussen. And then the second cross-reference that we would create would be for the third last name. So we go Sheridan, Jarvis, and Rasmussen Antiques. And no matter what, your C notation always has to refer back to the original. It should never refer back to another cross-reference. And so let's take a look at a really simple example. So let's say there's a brokerage firm, and I think it's something like Unruh Brokerage. So I'm going to go to U for Unruh. And so that actually opens up a cross-reference sheet, which basically tells me that Unruh isn't the first part of the name. The full name is Taylor and Unruh Brokerage. And so if I needed the phone number for this brokerage, I would go to my T folder under Taylor, find that file. So here's Taylor and Unruh Brokerage. And here's that phone number that I would retrieve. And so that's just one example of a compound business name. Let's take a look now at another example. So another time you might need to create a cross-reference is when you have business names with abbreviations and acronyms. So for example, most people recognize the organization MADD, which is short for Mothers Against Drunk Driving. So someone looking for the file might search under MADD, while another person might look under the full name of Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And so just to make sure that the record can be found either way, we file the record under the official name, which is Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And then we would also create a cross-reference that says C and then the original filing segment, which is MADD. And so this just helps anyone who searches by acronym to still be able to find the correct record pretty quickly. Now let's take a look at a more complex example that combines both an abbreviation and a compound business name. So let's say that we have this company called Easy Electronics, and the full name of this business come from the last names of the two founders, which is Ewan and Zucker. So the full name of Easy Electronics is Ewan and Zucker Electronics. The original file it would be filed under is E for Easy, and then Unit 2 would be Electronics. So we would then need to create a cross-reference, first for the full spelled out name, so Ewan and Zucker Electronics would be my first cross-reference. My C notation would be for the original file it was filed under, so C, Easy Electronics. But secondly, because it's also a compound business name formed with two partners' last names, so Ewan and Zucker, we need to create another cross-reference for the other partner's last name. So the other cross-reference we create is going to be for Zucker and Ewan Electronics. And our C notation is always going to refer us back to the original of C Easy Electronics. Just like how I mentioned before, you never refer back with your C notation to another cross-reference. And so by creating your cross-references this way, whether someone searches for the abbreviation, the full name, or just one of the partners, they'll still be directed to the original file, which is Easy Electronics. And so just to review, make sure that you use the alphabetic order, follow the rules of 1 through 4 for names, minor words, punctuation, and abbreviations, as well as those cross-references. Also, I strongly recommend that you try out the self-check that I've posted online. I've also posted the answers so that you can see if you're on the right track or not. If for whatever reason you don't know why you got something wrong or it didn't match up with the answer key, let me know immediately so that I can further explain it to you, because it's going to be really important that you understand these concepts as we move throughout the semester.